My husband and I recently moved into a new house. Moving during a pandemic is strange, to say the least. You really can't enlist help as you might otherwise, so everything seems to take a little longer and be a little more difficult. But we know too that it is such a privilege to be able to have a new space, and we are grateful. The house we moved into is old, built in the 1930s, and it is clear that many people have lived and loved here before we have. In our new house, I've been painting the whole kitchen white, trying to brighten it up and bring new light in. This is probably one of the first days I haven't had at least a few splotches of white paint on my hands or my arms. I've been painting so much that I've noticed there's something soothing about the brush moving up and down with the grain of the old wood, making small shing sounds, and making space for my mind to wander. Being in this new space has me thinking about this particular moment for our country and for our world. None of us has been here before to this new and sometimes lonely space where social distancing will be required for the long haul. None of us has done this before, and we will need sustenance for the journey. I know that we've been dealing with COVID for many months now, and many of us have had our fill of news. I understand and respect that truth. And also, it has become clear to me over the past few weeks as cases rise that COVID will continue to point to clear issues in our society until we are willing to listen. I am someone who was born in Arkansas, currently lives in Louisiana, and did chaplaincy training in the Florida Panhandle. The South is my home in body as well as in spirit. And it is hard to watch people here I love take risks with their own health, both due to financial necessity as well as misunderstanding. We must face the multifaceted reality in front of us. In my very limited outings here, I have heard people say, "I'm over coronavirus." I really wish that it worked that way. For the good of those we love and that of those we don't even know, we need a way through, a way to survive. I'm preaching this morning the sermon that my own heart needs to hear. Fall looms like a giant question mark in the sky. Everyone wants to know what will happen with schools. My heart goes out to the parents among us, as every option will have huge, huge challenges. I've been thinking about how we will get through this moment as a society, as people of faith, as a worshiping community. As I said earlier, during the time for all ages, there is a lot to hold in our hearts right now. And my heart has been feeling heavy these last few weeks, as we've watched states reopen too early, in my opinion, and risk lives in the name of capitalism. Our current reality is asking quite a lot of us mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually. COVID requires hypervigilance, triggers our anxieties, requires us to create fierce boundaries around news and social media. We have had, or will certainly have, deep and painful disagreements with those we love over racial justice, police brutality, the necessity of mask wearing, and social distancing. I know I'm not telling you anything new or that you don't already know, just naming the reality we are living. So where do we go to replenish our spirits now? Maybe you've had a spiritual practice for a long time. Maybe you're hearing of it for the first time this morning. Maybe you're somewhere in between. Whatever the case, now is most definitely the time to lean on things that ground us, that make us feel whole, that make our souls feel restored and alive. Because we need every bit of restoration and renewal that we can get. The Reverend Darcy Lane reminds us that building a spiritual practice takes time. Like developing a muscle, it will not happen overnight. Patience is key because, as she points out, it turns out beating yourself up about not doing your spiritual practice is actually not helpful. But practices are just that, practices. And things that we do for long enough, often enough, become ingrained in us. They live within our bones. I have seen folks struggling deeply with memory issues recall words and harmony to childhood hymns. For, as Reverend Darcy reminds us, our bodies remember when our minds are distracted or diminished. Something old and deep wakes up within us. Our lives are all full of the simple repetition that makes up a practice, if we can try to pay attention. When I first started divinity school 3 years ago now, I heard lots of talk about people's spiritual practices. Honestly, that was the kind of thing I thought I would learn about in divinity school, not use to get through divinity school. It felt kind of unsettling not to know what I was doing and to feel like everyone else had it figured out. There was lots of talk at the beginning of our first year about 5 a.m. meditation, but by the second semester, all of that kind of fell away. We were open with one another about struggling amidst the busyness of our days to find time to care for our spirits, even as we were trying to care for the spirits of others. And this honesty was very important, for in the words of Dinan Katagiri, the important point of spiritual practice is not to try to escape your life, but to face it exactly and completely. A spiritual practice is something which you repeat regularly, that grounds you in depth and connection. For me, a spiritual practice is something that makes you feel more connected to yourself and the world around you, that makes space for your mind to wander. In the words of Reverend Scott Alexander, a spiritual practice is made spiritual instead of being a hobby through one's commitment to making the activity a regular and significant part of your life. Or, to go further, by intentionality, regularity, and depth. He goes on to note that our lives are often characterized by a natural ebb and flow. Of course, spiritual practices can be dropped, replaced, or restarted as circumstances change, and we know they will change. The first person to model a spiritual practice for me, though I wouldn't have known to call it that at the time, was my mother. In our house growing up, she had an office with big windows that looked out into the greenery of our backyard. In the early hours of the morning, I would often wake to the sounds of her footsteps, soft and gentle on the floorboards, padding out to her office. I knew if I went out there, I would find her writing in a journal, maybe reading a book of poetry. As a kid, I thought this was just another weird thing my mom did. And as a preacher's kid, there were definitely a lot of those. But looking back, I see that she modeled starting each day with a little bit of care for the spirit. For, in Howard Thurman's words, in the stillness of the quiet, if we listen, we can hear the whisper of the heart, giving strength to weakness, courage to fear, and hope to despair. Over the years, I have experimented with different spiritual practices at different times in my life. I have had conversations with God while lying in grassy fields. I have journaled. I have read a psalm a day. I have done devotionals, written papers, and sang hymns. One thing I particularly miss right now is singing with other people. I've collected rocks and feathers and pieces of my grandmother's dishes and notes from friends and doilies made by my other grandmother's hands and built an altar. For in the words of May Sarton, it always goes back to the same necessity. Go deep enough and there is a bedrock of truth, however hard. Rest assured, I am certainly not trying to should on you or to add another thing to the long list of stuff you know you should do but really don't have time for. The older I get, the more I understand that time is a privilege and a luxury that not everyone has. And yet, I encourage you to snatch back a few minutes of it if you're able. For in the words of Mary Oliver, it doesn't have to be the blue iris. It could be weeds in a vacant lot. We are seeking the silence into which another voice may speak. Or, in the words of Marian Wright Edelman, learn to be quiet enough to hear the genuine within yourself, so that you can hear it in others. So now, when the sun rises in the morning, I tiptoe off to my office, facing our front yard, and I get out my markers and I color, noticing the fuchsia of the crepe myrtle buds and the way rain glitters on leaves in the sunlight after a storm. Gratitude flows within me for the day, for we are not aiming for perfection, but for survival. Amen.